say that it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Goff this evening. He is an author, a panpsychist philosopher, and a professor at Durham University. His research focuses on philosophy of mind and consciousness. Specifically, it focuses on how consciousness can be part of the scientific worldview. He holds that materialism is incoherent and that dualism leads to complexity, discontinuity, and mystery. Instead, he advocates a third way, that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the physical world. I have to confess that I have some doubts myself about this idea of panpsychism, but I look forward to becoming a little better informed about it. As good philosophers, we must always be open to reasoning and evidence, so we will see if we can change our minds this evening. So, Philip.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that kind introduction that summed up my view pretty well, I think. I'm not sure I have anything left to say now. But it's great to be able to speak with you tonight. I'm speaking to you actually from the shed in the bottom of my sister's garden, where I'm visiting her. So it's quite a nice shed, though. And yes, but anyway, it's great to be here with you. There's been a fair number of complexities involved that Andreas has suffered from with me doing this tonight. So I'm grateful to him that he's stuck with it and it's all worked out. Just to say briefly, I am suffering a little bit from a fatigue issue. I had a quite bad head injury about a year ago, which left some fatigue issues that I thought were completely gone away, but the last couple of weeks seem to be back. But I think what the only upshot of that is I usually talk quite passionately, but I think I'm going to just maybe talk in a slightly calmer way than normal. But hopefully all the content will be there. And don't let that hold you back from robust objections in the Q&A. I might just give a calm answer, but I'm happy to take robust objections. Okay, well, let's get on with it. So I'm just going to give a sort of general overview of the case for panpsychism, at least as I think of it. Well, let's start with the word consciousness itself. Do let me know if I'm not audible at any point. Because it is a bit of an ambiguous word people use in different ways. The way I use it, I think, is fairly standard in both science and philosophy, where consciousness is just subjective experience, pleasure, pain, seeing color, hearing sound. Your consciousness is what it's like to be you. So right now you're having a auditory experience of my voice speaking to you. Start saying auditory for American audiences. They don't understand auditory. Anyway, a visual experience of the room around you. If you pay attention, you can notice the tactile sensations of the chair beneath your body. This is all part of what it's like to be you right now. And that's really all we mean by consciousness. Some people sometimes say it's a mystery what consciousness is. Nobody knows what consciousness is. I don't like that way of putting it, actually. I think nothing is more obvious and evident than the reality of conscious experience. You know what pain is when you feel it. I think the mystery is rather how it fits in, how consciousness fits into our scientific story of the world more generally. My mum's just texted me saying, am I with my sister? Anyway, deal with that later. Okay, so you might think, well, why is this an issue for a philosopher at all? Why not? Isn't this just a scientific issue, right? Don't we just need to keep studying the brain and we'll work it all out? Well, I think there is something very unique about consciousness as a scientific phenomenon, namely that it's not publicly observable. You can't look inside somebody's head and see their feelings and experiences. We know about consciousness not from experiments or looking down a microscope. We know about consciousness just by being conscious, right? By being immediately aware of our own feelings and experiences. Now you might say, sometimes when I say this, people say, well, science can deal with things you can't observe, like fundamental particles. quantum wave functions, maybe even other universes that some scientists like to talk about, think about, maybe even argue for. But there is something utterly unique in the case of consciousness. In the case of consciousness, uniquely in the case of consciousness, I would say the thing we are trying to explain is not publicly observable. Right, so in all these other cases, fundamental particles, wave functions, or whatever, yes, we posit things we can't observe, but we posit them in order to explain what we can observe. That's what it's ultimately all about, explaining public observation experiments. Whereas in the unique case of consciousness, the explanandum, to use a technical word, the thing we're trying to explain is not publicly observable. So that makes it unique, I think. Now, that doesn't mean we can't deal with it scientifically. I think we can and do deal with it scientifically. So if it can't be publicly observed, how do you deal with it scientifically? Well, you can't observe consciousness, but if you're dealing with another human being, you can ask them what they're feeling and experiencing. And if you do that while you scan their brain, then you can start to correlate, or that's the hope anyway, which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of conscious experience. Even there, this is very challenging, and there is no consensus at the moment. There's different theories, but at least I think of that as the scientific task. Working out the correlations, which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of conscious experience. But I suggest that's not everything we want from a theory of consciousness. Ultimately, we want to answer the why question. We want to know why certain kinds of brain activity go along with feelings and experiences. Why should that be? What is going on in reality to make that the case? And I would say that is not a scientific question. That is not a question, because consciousness is not publicly observable. That is not a question you can answer with experiments. So with the science, we're limited to the correlation question, which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of experience. And then the philosophical question is, well, why? Why do brain activity and consciousness go together? Well, here's one proposed answer to that, often known as physicalism. Quite complex issues about how exactly we define physicalism, but I'm going to take it for today to be the view that consciousness will ultimately be explained in terms of physical processes in the brain. So maybe it'd be helpful to make an analogy here. If you think about the phase change of water from ice to liquid to steam, and then we think about the chemical explanation of that, we get a very satisfying explanation, right, in terms of the underlying molecular structures, right? When it's ice, we get a very rigid lattice structure, and the molecules can't move much. The hydrogen bonds are holding them very tight, and that's why ice is rigid and stuff. Then the temperature goes up. Well, temperature's measure of kinetic energy, and the bonds get loosened. A bit more flexibility, becomes fluid, liquid. And then at some point when atmospheric pressure is overcome by outward pressure, kinetic energy, then the bonds are broken, the molecular bonds are broken entirely, and it all roams free. Okay? And that's a very satisfying explanation once you know that underlying molecular story. I don't think you feel the need to say, okay, I get why the molecules are in that rigid structure and then more flexible, but why is there steam? Why is there liquid? I think no, that's completely answered. Once we know how the molecules are behaving, we have a complete explanation of this change in form of water. I mean, maybe there are theological questions, or why anything at all, but in terms of explaining um, the phase change of water in terms of the underlying molecular structure, I think we have a very satisfying explanation. It's that It's that kind of satisfying explanation which is entirely lacking in the case of consciousness. We know we know that certain kinds of brain activity go with feelings, but we have no explanation of why that would be the case. But anyway, the hope is, well, we'll one day get there, right? Maybe we just need to stick at it. Maybe we need the Einstein of the brain or something, and we'll one day get that satisfying explanation. And that, if we did get that, if we got an explanation of why people feel in terms of patterns of neural firings or whatever, we've got an explanation analogous to the explanation of the phase change of water. That would answer. That would be the end of the story, right? We'd no longer be stuck with just correlations. We'd have an explanation. Most people agree we're very far from that, but still, you might think we just need to keep going. I'm going to speed up a little bit. I'm going a bit slowly. Well, already given, I think we've been going on with this for so many decades now, I think it's at least gives you motivation to perhaps explore other possibilities. Also, however, I'm inclined to think this physicalist proposal is actually incoherent. It actually doesn't make sense. And that's why we've not been having progress on it. This idea that we can give a physical explanation of feelings and experiences, I think is an incoherent proposal. Okay, so that's a big claim. Let me try and justify it. So I think, some things obviously don't make sense. Like 2 + 2 is 5, or the idea of a married bachelor, it's just contradictory. It obviously doesn't make sense. But some things don't make sense in a more subtle way. And this is why you need philosophers. And so, at first, maybe something at first it seems to make sense. But when you spend a bit of time thinking about it more carefully, it turns out to be contradictory or incoherent. So one example that is perhaps a case of this is time travel, or at least time travel where you change the past. It's probably a bit of, I need to get more up-to-date references, but the Back to the Future story where I was obsessed with when I was a little boy. He goes back in time and nearly stops his parents meeting, and he starts to disappear off photographs. Okay, and when you watch the film, it seems to make sense at first. You've got the classic story as well, killing your grandfather or something before he produces your parents. And when you watch this film, it seems to make sense, but a lot of philosophers think actually, when you really think it through, it doesn't make sense because it seems to have this idea of like the first through of history and then the second run through of history. But it's like we're talking about time. There's no first run through and second run through. It's just the facts of time, right? Imagine God looking down at all the facts of time. So some have a lot of philosophers have the idea that this idea of changing the past, not necessarily time travel, but changing the past sort of doesn't make sense. Okay, so I guess I think something similar is going on with this idea that we can give a physical explanation of consciousness, that we can explain feelings in terms of patterns of neural firings or something. Um, it seems to make sense at first, but I think when you really think carefully about it, I don't think it does make sense. Why is that? Because I think we need to think carefully about what physical science is all about, what it's in the business of, what it's good at. And I think what it's all about ultimately is explaining behavior, explaining publicly observable behavior. Let's go back to our example of the phase change of water. What are we trying to explain when we explain the phase change of water? Well, we're trying to explain the behavior of this substance from being very rigid to being more flowy and flexible to being wilder, as it were. It's about the behavior. And we have a very satisfying explanation of the behavior of this substance in terms of the behavior of its components, of its molecular components. We could give a deeper explanation of the behavior of the molecules in terms of the behavior of the particles, the subatomic particles. Maybe we go to string theory. But wherever we stop, it's all about explaining behavior. That's what physical science does and has done for the past 500 years. That's what it's good at. I suggest, maybe you disagree, that when we're trying to explain consciousness, that's not what we're doing. We're not trying to explain why a system behaves a certain way. We're trying to explain why it feels a certain way. And I think that's just a different question. Now, there's nuance here, which is why you need to think carefully about it. Um, Obviously there's a close connection between feelings and behavior, right? If you're feeling pain, you're gonna scream and run away or whatever. That's true, and that's consistent with what I'm saying. My point is just, if I say, oh, why is my partner feeling pain? Focus on that question. Why is she feeling pain? That is not a question. I'm not asking why is she behaving in a certain way, or why are her inner parts behaving in a certain way. I'm asking why is she feeling a certain way, and I think it's just a different question. So this is why I think it doesn't make sense to the idea of a physical explanation of consciousness, because what a physical explanation is an explanation of behavior. And when we're trying to explain consciousness, we're not doing that. We're not trying to explain behavior. So here's an analogy I like to give. Imagine someone who says, telescopes, wow, they're brilliant for looking at the stars. It works so well. We should apply them in pure mathematics. They'll be brilliant. That would be absurd because these are just very different explanatory projects. I think the same about consciousness. I think physical science is wonderful. And I think people think, oh, it's wonderful. Of course, it's going to explain consciousness. But it's wonderful at explaining behavior. And I don't think we're trying to explain behavior when we're trying to explain consciousness. Okay. And I mean, also, in my book Galileo's Error, part of this is that the whole of physical science was set up by the father of modern science, Galileo, sort of with this pretty explicit. He like took consciousness out of the scientific story so that we could have physical science, so that we could have this purely mathematical behavioral science. Anyway, that's another question. That's another story. All right. Well, there's my negative case. Okay. The view I disagree with, which is the majority view. I'm an insurgent. Um, Although my view, the opponents of physicalism are a significant minority. There's Phil Paper's survey on this. There's 52% of philosophers on consciousness are physicalists, 32% are anti-physicalists, and then the others don't like the question or something. So I'm in the anti-physicalist camp. Okay, so that's obviously there's a bigger debate here. You can go for my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, if you want all the annoying, boring details. But that's a rough idea of why I think physicalism, the mainstream view of scientists and philosophers, is not a goer. And that's why it's not been working out, because it doesn't make sense. Okay, now for the positive. So what do I propose instead? This view has already been mentioned. I've spent most of my career, I guess, defending this panpsychist view. And I think a way into it is that what panpsychism does is it takes the physicalist approach and turns it upside down. So rather than starting with to move myself so I can see my words, rather than starting with matter, the standard approach is we start with matter, physical stuff, try and get consciousness out of that. I don't think that can be done for what the reasons I've been giving. The panpsychist tries to do it the other way around. Start with consciousness, start with very simple forms of consciousness and try and account for everything else, the emergence of physical reality, the entire universe in terms of these very simple forms of conscious experience. It's a very ambitious project, right? It's not just trying to explain consciousness, it's trying to explain the whole of reality in terms of consciousness in terms of very simple forms of conscious experience. So think of it, the mirror image of each other. Do we start with physical reality, try and get consciousness out? Or do we start with consciousness and try and get physical reality out? I think the latter. So I think the first doesn't make sense. And I think the latter project, actually, we've kind of solved all the mysteries. I think we actually, surprising as it might sound, we know how to make sense of that. We know how to make sense of how it could be that physical reality could emerge from a story about simple forms of consciousness. So I don't, anyway, yeah. Okay, and the inspiration here is drawn from very important work of Bertrand Russell from the 1920s. Actually, this is a picture of Russell when he was a lot older. But anyway, it's a sort of more familiar picture. Um, but it's really back to Russell that we draw inspiration in the sort of contemporary panpsychist research community. I'm just going to turn this heater off. I thought I would need a heater. I'm in the garden. It's just next to me. How do I do that? Okay. Got very hot. Okay, so Russell's starting point. This is actually, if you want to chase it up, in The Analysis of Matter in 1927. Fascinating book, shortly after quantum mechanics sort of first emerged and relativity, and we've got this brilliant philosopher reflecting on the philosophical implications. He was a great mathematician as well. The philosophical implications of these new theories. I kind of wish I'd been there. It's really exciting to see Russell talk, lecture around this time on this topic. Anyway, so Russell's starting point in this book, The Analysis of Matter, was that physics doesn't really tell us what matter is. When I first heard that, I thought that's ridiculous. That's just absurd. If you read any book of physics or cosmology, you have this rich story of the nature of space and time and matter. But what Russell was getting at, his point was, well, look, physics for all its virtues is purely mathematical. It's just a bunch of equations. And because of that, in a sense, if you can allow me to personify physics slightly, Mr. Physics, right? Mr. Physics doesn't care what fundamental reality is. All physics cares about is that fundamental reality, whatever it is, has the right mathematical structure. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, Mr. Physics is happy. Imagine, sorry, I don't know whether this is helpful. You got Mr. Physics and, God goes to Mr. Physics and goes, do you want to know? Do you want to know ultimate reality? Physics go, no, just tell me the structure of it. As long as it's the right structure, I'm happy. A final page of A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking famously said something that might have, it was a bit difficult to get exactly what he was getting at, but anyway, might have meant something along these lines. He said, well, even when we get final physics, it will be, Hawking said, just bunch of equations. It won't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. Okay, so in this sense, if you like, physics has a certain ontological neutrality. It's sort of in a sense neutral on what's going on at the fundamental level. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, that's all physics cares about. This is the hardest bit of, the position, and thinking of different ways to argue for it. Let me tell you my latest way on the next slide of trying to help people make sense of this. I'm going to make an analogy to simulation theory. People know this, that the philosopher Nick Bostrom has famously defended this idea. Maybe we're living in a computer simulation, right? Maybe our universe is just a simulation on some computer in the next universe up. Some software engineer is running a little experiment simulating a universe, and that's our universe. The wonderful show Black Mirror explores a lot of these possibilities. How does Bostrom make sense of that? I mean, how can we be in a simulation? You've sort of got cups and liquid and black holes and big bangs and we're, we're not living in a simulation. How can these be simulated? But I suppose Bostrom's thought is, or one way of getting at it is, well, look, physics is just mathematics. You could, in principle, get the entire description of reality you get from fundamental physics and turn it into ones and zeros. It's just mathematics. We could turn it into ones and zeros. And if it's ones and zeros, if you've got a complicated, it'd have to be a bloody complicated computer, but if you had a complicated enough computer, you could run that program, right? So, what this reveals, I'm not saying simulation theory is true, but I think it's coherent and it's coherent, well, except maybe for consciousness anyway. Put that on one side. It's coherence because we can, in a sense, think of, because physics is purely mathematical, we can sort of, it's sort of like software. It's software that could be run on different kinds of hardware. That's another way of thinking of this point, like physics doesn't care what reality is like. It's sort of, it's just software. I don't care what the hardware is, as long as it's complex enough to run the software. So simulation theory is one proposal about what the software is. Panpsychists are offering another proposal. Sorry, about what the hardware is. Panpsychists are offering another proposal. So that's how panpsychists are one way of seeing how they're trying to explain physical reality in terms of consciousness. They're saying, well, look, physics is software. We're going to tell you a story about the hardware upon which physics runs. So here's the proposal. The idea is what there is at the fundamental level of reality are networks of very simple conscious entities behaving in simple, predictable ways because they have very simple experiences, behave in simple, predictable ways. Through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures. And then the thought is those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. So we get physics out of this underlying story of conscious entities. So reality just bottoms out in simple conscious entities. And through their interactions, they realize the software of physics. So I think this is the question of whether it's a true story, but I think it's a coherent story. So I think we can tell a coherent story about how physical reality could emerge from consciousness. Thanks to Bertrand Russell, the Darwin of consciousness, we can do that. At the very least, so I think that's the advantage the panpsychist has over the physicalist. Right? The physicalist is trying to get consciousness out of physical stuff. We've never had any look at that. I think there's good reason to think it's not a coherent project. The panpsychist is doing it the other way around, trying to get physical reality out of consciousness. And I think we've got a clear, coherent story as to how that could be done. Okay? So we're contrasting two theories of consciousness, or two theories of reality, I suppose. Um, the panpsychist one, I think the mysteries are solved. We know how to make sense of it, right? So I just think it looks to be the more plausible theory because it's coherent, its mysteries are solved. Um, did I say something else then? Oh yeah, I think the only downside to my mind is, it feels a bit weird. It's not very fashionable in the current moment, although things have been changing in the last 10 years, which is quite exciting. But I just think when you look at it objectively, when you appreciate that the scientific data on consciousness leaves open these options, physicalism or panpsychism, and then you say, well, panpsychism got this kind of worked out story, physicalism sort of hasn't. I think that's what just looks to be the more plausible theory. Okay, so that's the second part of the talk. So we've had the negative case, the critique of physicalism. We've had the positive case for panpsychism. Let's finish with um, a problem for panpsychism. To play fair, come on, stop. I've got to give the other side of this. Um, let's talk a little bit about what's generally seen as the biggest problem for panpsychism. What's become known as the combination problem. That term is due to Canadian philosopher Bill Seeger. There are lots of different ways of spelling this out precisely, but the basic worry is, okay, you're postulating these simple conscious entities, but how do they combine together to make our consciousness, the complex consciousness of the human or animal brain? How do we make sense of that? It seems like we know how you can make a functioning car engine from bits of a car, or organs from cellular bits, but how little minds come to make big minds, something, or at least it's hard to make sense of, and some people try to argue is just unintelligible. Okay, so this is an important challenge. It's where I think a lot of the energies of the panpsychist research community are focused, and there are a lot of very interesting proposals. Often can get somewhat technical at this point because you get into the sort of complexities, but let me just share with you one way of trying to solve this problem. Um, I guess I'm sympathetic to appeal to a certain kind of relationship that holds between experiences, arguably commonly referred to in the literature as the co-consciousness relation, the relationship two or more experiences have of being can have of being experienced together. So think about your consciousness now. I mean, that's so special about consciousness? We just have this direct connection to it. You can just directly attend to your feelings and experiences. Um, so right now you're having lots of different experiences, seeing color, hearing sound. But I would say those experiences aren't just sort of existing in isolated packets. Rather, you experience them all together. You have an experience that incorporates all of these different sub-experiences, as it were. So you don't just hear music and see the book. You have a single experience of both hearing the music and seeing the book simultaneously. So some panpsychists want to say, we've got this very special connection to direct awareness of our consciousness, and when we reflect on it, we find not just experiences, but this sort of relationship between experiences. Um, that's a nice thing about consciousness. I think well, I'll try not to ramble. I'll maybe bring in some more ramblings at the end. Um, so once you appreciate this, take into account, it, it seems the various experiences you're right now apprehending, they could stop standing in this co-consciousness relation, or some of them could. So you could imagine maybe your auditory experiences will stop bearing the co-consciousness relation to your other experiences. What would result from that? You'd have one set of auditory experiences that are all unified, co-conscious with each other, and then you've got all the other experiences, visual, sensory, emotional, unified and co-conscious with each other. You'd end up with sort of fragmentation, two minds. We could take it further that Maybe your visual experiences stop being co-conscious with your other experiences. Your emotions stop being co-conscious with your other experiences. This fragmentation could continue if we broke, if we stopped it being the case that these experiences stand in the co-consciousness relationship to each other. Well, the panpsychist will say if you keep doing that, you'll eventually get down to the consciousness of particles. And what has happened in evolution is that natural selection has taken simple conscious entities, built them up through the co-consciousness relation until we get the highly evolved experience we know and love today. Okay, so that's one way of saying, no, we do have a coherent story of there's something we find in our own experience that solves the problem here. That would be the claim. Here's one kind of objection, or maybe a way of maybe you can think of this as a way of running the combination problem from a different angle. Not so much, okay, how does combination happen? But a different kind of challenge. Say, well, look, if what you've just said is true, if my conscious experience is made up of the experience of trillions of particles, sorry, that's a typo there, isn't it? Should say just the experience of trillions of particles, or um, shouldn't I be aware of those trillions, what those trillions of particles are experiencing, right? If my consciousness is made up, I mean, how many trillions is an understatement, isn't it? How many gagillions? That's a technical term, gagillion. No, you 10 to the power or whatever. Or if all of those particles are conscious and they're all making up my experience right now, it seems like my experience should be a lot busier. You know what I mean? A lot busier. Sort of doesn't have this kind of nice homogeneous. I mean, there's a lot of complexity, obviously, a hell of a lot of complexity in human experience, but it just sort of doesn't feel that complex as if it was sort of trillions of particle experience. So that's a different kind of problem raising here. Different ways of responding to this. Here's one I'm not sure what I think of, but I have been thinking of a lot of these things. Examined a PhD by a very good young panpsychist a couple of weeks ago with a wonderful name, Forrest Schreck. Forrest Schreck, excellent. Look out for him, Forrest Schreck, Central European University in Vienna. Um, so, and he's drawing on thoughts, reflections, but work from the 18th century. Was he 18th or 17th? God, that's terrible. I can't remember whether it was 18th or 17th century. Philosopher Leibniz, right, who was also the inventor of calculus, or was he? Him and Newton fought over who invented calculus, made Newton very angry. Wasn't a very nice person, Newton. Anyway, um, but anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So it's not obvious. Maybe we're not aware of all our experiences. I mean, it's a difficult question. Could you have an experience you're not aware of? Some people, some philosophers say, of course not. If you're experiencing it, you've got to be aware. You've got to be aware of your experience. But think about, if you're driving on autopilot, you just a very familiar journey, and you get home and you think, I'm here, and you're thinking about something else. Were you experiencing the road? Maybe you were experiencing it, but you weren't aware of your experience. Or when you suddenly realize there's been a buzzing noise that you've been experiencing for the last 10 minutes, or the feel of the clothes on your body. Now you're thinking of that maybe now I've made you aware of it, but were you aware of that? Were you experiencing it before you were aware of you experiencing it? A lot of interesting empirical work here on change blindness. Here's an example. I have to move myself again. Can anyone, actually, if I was there in person, I could ask, anyone see the difference? Just spot the difference, really. What's the difference between? Well, there's a big bush somewhere that's in one but not the other. Now it takes you kind of while to work that out, but so before you realized that, you were not aware of this difference in your experience between the two photos. Does that mean you weren't aware, you weren't experiencing the difference? There wasn't that difference in your experience? Um, and there's, the change blindness has sort of shown that there's a lot of richness to our visual experience that we're actually not aware of. So some philosophers say, well, that means actually visual experience is much sparser than we ordinarily think. Alvin Noe, famous philosopher, has argued, we're actually only aware of sort of three things at a time, three or four things. So the sense that visual experience is very rich is an illusion. Whereas others like Ned Block will say, no, 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 no. Experience is very rich. We're just not always aware of all the detail. He distinguishes between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness, sort of what you're experiencing. Access consciousness is what bits of your experience are you cognitively aware of? And he thinks there can be a difference. Well, if you think that, how far can we take this? If you think we can have experiences we're not aware of, or there can be some aspects of our experience we're not aware of, how far can we take this? Maybe I am experiencing the consciousness of trillions of particles, but I'm not aware of it all. Something doesn't feel quite right. It feels like it's taking it too far, but so I'm torn on this because I do find it very plausible, the starting point that there are aspects of our experience or experiences that we're not aware of. But then when you take it to this extreme case of these trillions of particle experiences we're just not aware of at all, but we're experiencing, it seems something's gone wrong. But maybe it's just because these other examples we've given, you're not aware of them, but you can easily become aware of them. But maybe it opens the door to there's lots of aspects of our experience that we're just not aware of and not able to access. And maybe it's hard for us to make sense of that because it's like the sort of refrigerator light or something. Is that, every time you reflect on an experience, you're reflecting on it. And so maybe it's just hard for us to make sense of, but maybe it is coherent that we could be having all sorts of busyness and rich structure in our experience that we're not aware of. So I don't know. Something to think about. Okay. But I do want to emphasize, I mean, there are challenges to the combination problem. It might end up being we have to add some kind of primitives. But I want to emphasize, as I've sort of hopefully made clear, that there are two forms of explanation involved in the panpsychist story. One is mental combination, which has been talked about, explaining human animal consciousness in terms of particle consciousness or consciousness of fields. But there's another kind of explanation that's totally different, totally separate to that, which is the physics as software stuff, explaining physicality in terms of simple forms of consciousness. So even if we have to add some extra kind of primitives to deal with the combination problem, we've still got this explanation of physical reality in terms of simple forms of consciousness. And that's why I think panpsychism ends up being however we go with the combination problem, ends up being a very simple, elegant, parsimonious story. We explain the whole of reality in terms of consciousness, the one thing we have direct access to. And I think this shows us that we don't need anything more. We should respect Occam's razor. We know consciousness exists by being conscious, and we can get everything else just from consciousness. So why believe in anything else? Okay, I've got some stuff on recent stuff I've been I wouldn't work on philosophy of physics and quantum mechanics on my own, but I've been collaborating with Kelvin McQueen, who has a physics background, and exploring a neglected interpretation of quantum mechanics from the 1990s, which was like many worlds, but all the consciousness goes down one of the branches. Anyway, unfortunately, I think it's half past, so I would just come to the final point, and it's two of my books. Galileo's Error, I suppose, is if you want the kind of basic uh, problem of consciousness and panpsychism solution and physicalism and dualism, belief in the soul. And then a more recent book, modestly titled Why the Purpose of the Universe, is sort of thinking about spiritual implications, and does panpsychism offer a sort of middle way between belief in God and atheism? Okay, and then there's my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, or a book, a co-edited volume of mine called Is Consciousness Everywhere, where some leading scientists like Sean Carroll, um, what's his name, Ravelli, respond to my panpsychism or my work. Okay. Anyway, let me sum up the argument. So I think the philosophical challenge of consciousness is, why does brain activity correlate with consciousness? We've explored two solutions to that problem. Consciousness can be explained in terms of physical brain, in terms of brain activity, or solution B, physical reality can be explained in terms of consciousness. And my view, which you're free to disagree with me on, obviously, is we've made no progress with solution A and it's incoherent, but we know how to make sense of solution B. So that for that reason, it's more plausible. Got loads more stuff on my website, philipgoffphilosophy.com. I'm going to start doing my Substack more regularly now. Weekly, I think. I just sort of hardly ever do it. Always arguing on Twitter, Philip_Goff, Blue Sky. I've got TikTok. I've only done one though. I might start doing TikTok. There's too much to do. Anyway, I'd like to know what you think. Thank you for listening. Hello. Are people still there? Oh, I thought the room had there'd been an explosion or something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Hi,
Excellent,
Andreas.
excellent. Yes, I was just doing a sort of quick paraphrase of your talk. Well, first of all, thank
Oh,
you
right.
very
Oh,
much.
thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I highlighted to the audience and asked the question whether their whole world view had been inverted by what you've just delivered or not. So there will be lots of questions around that. And I talked about reality either coming out of matter and then consciousness arriving from that, or the other way around. We start off with consciousness and derive matter as a result. So there's lots of stuff going on online now in terms of questions, which is great. But we'll start as usual in the room. We've got a deadline, obviously, as usual at 9 o'clock, but I'm sure if I can ask people when they ask questions to restrict themselves to one sentence with no more than one subclause, rather than delivering their own view of the universe, that would be really helpful. And likewise, Philip, if you could be quite short on the answer, that would be helpful as well. So who would like to go first in the room? Gentleman at the front.
This is a bit of a tangent, but there was a fairly recent paper by Rupert Sheldrake about, is the sun conscious? Being a complex system, it would be capable of consciousness, and he thought that we could experiment with this to see if it's pointing itself towards other stars in order to eat them. What do you make of that paper? What do you make of that work?
Yeah, I know Rupert very well, and he actually sent me the manuscript of that before he submitted it, and I commented on it. And I'm good friends with Rupert. I think Rupert's more an empirical scientist than a philosopher. So people ask me, "What do you think of Rupert's stuff?" And um, usually, I will give you an answer. Well, no, I've been told to give short answers. Um, yeah, I think he's on. He hasn't really strongly made the case for that. I mean, I'm not opposed to the idea of the universe conscious. It's just very hard to answer the scientific question because consciousness is not publicly observable. There is no consensus on what is required, what kind of physical activity does give you consciousness, does give you mental combination if you're a panpsychist. Let me just say something quickly. What I'm inclined to think we need to do, because I think actually forget the big questions we've been talking about today. How you interpret the scientific data of consciousness, I think depends on your philosophical assumptions, like whether you think you can have an experience you're not aware of. Which way, because there's a big dispute over whether consciousness is in the front or the back of the brain. I think the reason there's a big debate on that is because the scientists are going different ways on that philosophical assumption. So I think what we need to do is sort of fragment the research community and have sort of teams of philosophers and scientists setting up experiments under philosophical assumptions, interpreting the data under philosophical assumptions, and see which bears fruit. Problem with that is still society at the moment doesn't take philosophy seriously enough. Fortunately, you can't do without it with consciousness. So I think, look, we just need to get consensus. We need to get a scientific theory of consciousness that tells us when something is conscious, and then we can answer Rupert's question. But until we do that, I don't think we can make that strong a case.
Okay, there's more questions in the room. If you could speak directly into the microphone.
Thank you. I found your talk stimulating, but puzzling. Sorry, can you hear me all right? Is it?
I can.
Oh, sorry. I think it depends a lot on your definition of consciousness. Now, to me, the only sensible definition of consciousness, I think, is the ability to create a narrative, an internal narrative. That seems to me what human consciousness is. And I'm not quite sure how, in your view of consciousness, there is any internal narrative created.
Yeah, good. So you're sort of have concerns from the very first slide about, yeah, it's difficult to know. I mean, there is, how do we start with understanding what consciousness is? I mean, I suppose however we choose to define it, that there is such a thing, I would say, as feelings and experiences that much simpler animals than us have. Rabbits, mice, I think it's clear, feel pain. Do they have a narrative running through their heads? That sounds more sophisticated, more like self-reflection. So I think you can have feelings and experiences even if you don't have a narrative running through your head. Whether or not you want to call that consciousness, there's a big problem of how you explain the pain of a mouse in terms of its physical makeup. And so maybe you don't want to call it consciousness, but that's at least a very serious problem. And I suppose that's just what I'm focused on, and a lot of other people too. But yeah, maybe there are other definitions of consciousness that raise different problems, and I wouldn't want to rule that out.
Well, maybe consciousness is such a slippery word, and maybe it means different things at different levels of experience. You know, we haven't really delved into this. You know, what is an infinitesimally small experience of an atom or of a electron? What does that mean in relation to our experience at a sophisticated level? So I'm not going to ask a question about this, Philip. I'll just leave that question open to let other people ask more questions.
I wanted to explore that same issue. As a scientist, I spent a lot of my life as a biologist and in classical physics, which ultimately gave us our explanation of the world, computing and everything. But in the last few years, I've been looking at quantum biology, and it's turned everything on its head. It's a different reality. So my question is, do you think consciousness could be a fundamental quantum phenomenon?
Quantum phenomenon. I mean, I suppose I mean, quantum mechanics deals with the level of fundamental physics, which is what quantum mechanics focuses on. So in that sense, quantum phenomenon. I suppose I do think though it's clearly more than a quantum phenomenon, that large scale macro level brain activity is also correlated with consciousness. Now, some people like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff try to say, well, it's actually the quantum stuff in the brain, the microtubules that are where the consciousness is based. Um, I guess I'm inclined. I'm a bit boring inclined with the more mainstream side. Oh God, I've got a mainstream view here. That doesn't look empirically plausible. That the parts of the brain that are associated with consciousness, you already had quantum collapse. So I'm not sympathetic to. I love Penrose, but I'm not sympathetic to that, to his view on consciousness. So yeah, I've been bringing quantum mechanics and consciousness together in a different way, which is to thinking of. I mean, like I'm more sympathetic to the kind of view where consciousness collapses the wave function, which is a very different kind of view. That David Chalmers and Kelvin McQueen, who's also collaborating with me, have sort of they don't necessarily think it's true, but they've kind of rigorously worked it out. And some people mock this, say, oh, oh, just because there's two mysterious things, you bring them together. But look, if like me, you think you need to add consciousness to the story of physics, controversial, but that's what I think. And I don't know how much to go into quantum mechanics. There's also, I think, on most theories of quantum mechanics, you have to add something as well. Um, for example, like collapse, you have to add extra axioms of collapse. So we've got these two cases where you have to add something to your fundamental theory. We should at least explore the possibility that you just add one thing and you get both. And so that's my case for taking quantum theory, quantum theories of consciousness. Sorry, the other way around, consciousness-based theories of quantum mechanics seriously. I'm not saying they're correct, but that sort of drive to parsimony, unity, simplicity, we should take them more seriously than we currently do.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We've got some questions online now, then we come back into the room. So one question is, does this theory explain why a brain seems to be a requirement for consciousness? Is there something special about particle behavior within neural networks, or is it simply because sensory experiences are processed in the brain? So this allows us to experience the result of conscious particles.
So yeah, I should have been clear. I hope it's so. Panpsychists don't think everything is conscious. Some of them do actually. Luke Roelofs thinks absolutely everything's conscious, like this cup. I think Annika Harris, who's got a best-selling book on consciousness, is inclined to that view. But I'd say most panpsychists think particles are conscious or fields are conscious. I talk about particles for the sake of simplicity, but many theoretical physicists inclined to think actually fields make up our universe. Um, and then at some point, in some limited circumstances, you get mental combination. And look, it's a scientific question. We need, as I say, we need scientists and philosophers working together. So the scientists need to tell us which physical activity at the macro level gives you consciousness. And then the philosophers plug in their explanation of that. In the panpsychist case, they'll say, well, that's where you get mental combination. That's where you get co-consciousness. Um, so you need to combine the science and the philosophy to get an explanation. Unfortunately, we're very, very far away from having a scientific explanation of. So yeah, I mean, I'm open to probably my favorite. I'm attracted to the integrated information theory, which says actually consciousness is more widespread than just the brain. It's when you get a certain kind of integration in the whole system, but it could be outside of a brain. Um, so I'm not tied to it being, it's at least in the brain, but I'm not tied to it being just in the brain. But it's just very early days. And I think, as I say, my hope for making more progress is fragmenting the field, bringing scientists and philosophers together.
Okay, another question online. Can you please also explain the relationship between panpsychism, animism, and non-duality? Physicalism seems to beg the duality.
So just taking the animism question, I suppose animism is life is everywhere. Um, again, got questions of what we mean by consciousness, questions of what we mean by life. I mean, if by life we mean sort of complex biological functions, then I don't think life is everywhere. But maybe by life we mean some sort of, I don't know, energetic psychic force or something. And then maybe we start to get something closer to panpsychism and, I think forms of animism in that sense well, I'm not an expert, but I have a sense for have been widespread in many cultures throughout the world before the modern period. Non-duality. Um, I don't know. I'm not. I mean, physicalists can be, in a sense, there's just one kind of stuff. So both panpsychism and physicalism just bottom out in one kind of stuff. So in that sense, I think they're in better shape in that regard than dualism, where you've got two kinds of stuff. You've got consciousness in the soul, and then you've got the body and the brain as separate. But maybe by duality, you mean something sort of more connected to Hindu mysticism, Advaita Vedanta, where you're sort of moving beyond the duality that seems to penetrate ordinary consciousness to some non-dual state. Now, there are very good panpsychist philosophers who connect panpsychism to Indian philosophy. David Buelis, a young philosopher at Princeton. Itai Shani, uh, Miriel Bahari, very good Australian philosopher. So yeah, so there are philosophers. I'm a bit more, I suppose. I'm more into my spirituality is Eastern Christianity. So sort of which is slightly less sexy than Advaita Vedanta maybe, but um still sexier than Western Christianity. Anyway, that's my spiritual home. But you
We
know,
will, okay, thank you, Philip. We won't delve into what Eastern Christianity means to you, but it seems to be that your fan club is online. They all say what a wonderful talk, and it resonates
oh,
with them, which is great. Alice asked the question, what would you say is the difference between consciousness and self-awareness of consciousness?
yeah, well, as I say, things like change blindness seem to bring out that there is a big difference. I think clearly rabbits feel pain, but can they? I love my cat very much. Very recently, we've got a cat, and anyway, um, but can a rabbit or a cat sort of attend to think, oh, it's that pain again? Can attend in that way to their experiences? It seems to be at least a more sophisticated thing, and and I think in human beings, I think most of our experiences and throughout the day, we're not, especially as you get older. That's why it's important to, I think as a child, you experience everything, but then as you get older, you get more autopilot, and why it's more important to meditate to bring your reflective awareness onto actually what you're experiencing. But I think the two kind of come apart. But I also think I do think there are puzzles here that haven't been explored. What the hell is self-consciousness? Can we give, suppose I'm right that, suppose we take consciousness as fundamental. Can we then give a physicalist account of self-consciousness? Is it just a sort of monitoring? That doesn't seem right to me. So maybe we have to add self-consciousness as a sort of primitive again. I think actually philosophers just haven't explored these issues. They just focus on feelings. I think that I think there is a difference, but I think there are underexplored issues with what the hell self-consciousness is, how we
Okay,
make sense of it.
you heard it from Philip. Be in touch with your inner child. Very important. There you go.
Oh,
Yeah,
actually, it was from my 15-year-old daughter, Alice says. Fantastic.
yeah. Thanks for. I guess my question about the narratives and maybe about rabbits is, does panpsychism, or the way we've been talking tonight at least, privilege forms of consciousness that can articulate themselves versus whatever consciousness a rock might have, it has no hope of articulating itself.
Yeah, it's a good question. You might think, I don't know whether in your question is, I guess I'm the kind of panpsychist who thinks rocks aren't conscious, and maybe Luke Rolofs or Annika Harris, my fellow panpsychists, might say to me, well, that's just because you're focusing on our particular kind of consciousness that can express itself in behavior. Um, might be a good point, I suppose. On the other hand, I do think many forms of consciousness cannot be reflectively articulated, or the pain of a mouse cannot be, it can't talk. in a narrative way about it, at least. And I'm inclined to think very simple life forms, bed bugs. There's something that it's like to be a bed bug. I don't think they have narrative experience. Fly, when a fly is bashing against the window, I think it's suffering in some simple sense. So yeah, so I do think consciousness in its pure form isn't reflective, but there might be challenges here that I need to think more about. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got another questions in the room and probably have room for one more after this.
No, thanks, Philip. I guess my question is, if we throw ourselves forward 100 years, I've got two competing thoughts, and I want to know, where you might land. One is, we never get any closer to this. It's as compelling a theory as any, but it's of such a hidden inner sanctum that there's nothing that can be produced. There's no paper that can be written, no equation, no experiment that's going to prove or disprove your theory. I think I know Philip, and I know what it felt like you to deliver this talk, but solipsism isn't even ruled out in my mind at this point, because it is of that essence. So one view is 100 years' time, we're still having this debate, and there's lots of words and different views. Because of its fundamental essence, it's unknowable, as it were. The other competing thought is the march towards general superintelligence and AI, whether that might almost accidentally give us some kind of insight.
Thank you. Lots of great questions tonight. Thank you very much. I haven't been saying that, but there have been. Yeah, on the first point, I mean, I kind of agree with you, but I think that's just because it's sort of philosophy rather than pure science. I think, when you've got a very concrete experimental question, like, uh, the water cycle, how does the water, or I don't know, you can make progress because you could sort of answer the questions and I can understand why people get frustrated by philosophy in contrast that it seems more nebulous and intangible. But I think it's just the nature of the question. If we're not just asking, okay, what's going on with this observable behavior? If we're asking, why do some systems feel a certain way, or we're asking about value, or we're asking about um, mathematical truth, the nature of mathematical truth, and these aren't sort of straightforward empirical questions. So in a sense, yes, Aristotle begins the Nicomachean Ethics saying, look, there's different levels of certainty. You can have best certainty with mathematics, where you prove something. Certain empirical questions, less certain. And even within science, there are questions where, like in quantum mechanics, where it's sort of very difficult there's still scope for interpretation, even when you've got the data in. So I think what we need to do really is just accept that philosophy is part of life, and we can't just do the experiments. We tried that with logical positivism in the 1940s. We know it doesn't work. And I think actually maybe once people are used to that and they think, yeah, it's very uncertain, it's not just like we can prove it with an experiment, maybe we will reach more consensus. I think we're in a period of history where people think it's got to be like that. It's got to be like that. We're looking for the experiment that'll just put. Maybe once we realize, no, hold on, you just need to do some philosophy and reflect. Maybe if everyone does that and is less sort of into that scientific idea, then maybe we will get consensus. I'm kind of hopeful about that actually. And it will be less certain, but maybe we'll get consensus that it's our best guess. The other problem, AI, yeah. Oh God, what's his name? Sam Altman is saying, predicting a crash that we might be nearing the end of it. I don't know. I mean, I've got views about AI that they're ignoring that, intelligence and understanding, conceptual understanding are hence inherently consciousness involving, not things that large language models have. And I wonder whether we are nearing the end of, I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable, isn't it, what LLMs can do, but where we are reaching the end of that. I suppose I'm a little bit more tentatively skeptical of the, you know, explosion, but very uncertain. It's all very uncertain. Who the heck? I mean, what are they doing, LLMs? They're noting what we do on the internet. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's a bit overhyped. where that can ultimately get us. But I might be wrong. I might very well be wrong.
Okay, so those questions remain unanswered for now. Is AI going to solve the problems of consciousness for us? Question mark. And is AI ever going to be conscious itself? Question mark. So put it all in a time capsule, which can be opened in 100 years' time, and we'll find out what the answer might be. But to the last question of the evening, this gentleman here.
I apologize if this is a very sort of uninformed and naive question, but where does the unconscious fit into all this?
Yeah, not naive at all. Nobody knows what the hell's going on with this stuff. The unconscious. Yeah, I haven't talked much about the unconscious. I've actually been thinking about it a lot recently. So I suppose a lot of philosophers interested in this kind of stuff I've been talking about think, well, the unconscious isn't a problem. It's just, there's just some physical processing that hasn't come to consciousness yet. There's no problem here. But I don't know, I've been thinking about this stuff that I was talking about today, like, can you have experiences you're not aware of? And I was kind of thinking maybe we can make more sense of the unconscious in this sense, because I think understanding is a kind of conscious experience. If I'm thinking about mathematics or conceptual thoughts about this being a cup is sort of part of how I experience it as a cup, as a face. Um, but I also think there's things that inform my day-to-day behavior that I'm not consciously thinking about, like that I'm in London, I'm giving a talk. I'm sort of not consciously thinking about them, but in some sense they are informing me. And I might write on this. I was just thinking, maybe we can make sense of these in terms of conscious thoughts that we're not aware of. So maybe there's all sorts of conscious thoughts all the time going on in your brain that you're not aware of, but are in some way informing. I don't know. It's hard to know how to put it. They're informing you, even though you're not consciously aware of them. Anyway, that's what I've been thinking of.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. We've come to the end of the talk. Normally, we could obviously invite you for a beer afterwards, Philip, but
Oh, that
we
would
could
be
continue
lovely.
the conversation. Unfortunately, with Zoom, what's going to happen is when the Zoom ends, we're going to get cut off. So I think next time when you're in Bath in person, maybe we can take you out for a drink and a meal to make it all worthwhile for you. But in the meantime, can you please all put your hands together for a very thought-provoking talk?